On the streets of Folkestone, Kent, amid the Second World War, 18-year-old Caroline Trayler disappeared after being seen drinking at the local pub one Sunday evening in June 1943. When Police Constable Lewis entered a bombed-out grocer's shop several days later in the hunt for the missing woman, he discovered a tragic scene which confirmed that the missing persons case had now become a murder inquiry. Please stay tuned until the end, as there are a couple of surprising twists that I'd love to know your thoughts on. Welcome to Prash's Murder Map. Caroline Ellen Stapleton was born on 1st of February 1925. Little is known of her childhood, but at the age of 17, she was living with her parents at 3 Sussex Road, Folkestone, on Kent's southeast coast, and working as an usherette at a cinema, earning 30 shillings a week, worth about £90 today. Described as attractive and outgoing, with striking auburn hair, Caroline met Sergeant Joseph William Edgar Trayler of the Durham Light Infantry in February 1942 while he was stationed in the coastal town. Joseph had just turned 21, but had already witnessed the horrors of war, having been among the 330,000 Allied troops evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940. They married just 8 months later, but their happiness was short-lived. Sergeant Trayler was posted to North Africa, while Caroline remained in Folkestone. As the wife of a serving soldier, she received a military pension but continued working at the cinema. On Sunday 13th of June 1943, Caroline, now 18, finished her shift at 9 p.m, changed out of her uniform and headed to her local pub, the Mechanics' Arms on St John's Street, just a few minutes from home. Caroline was looking forward to an evening of socialising. Though she wore both her engagement and wedding rings, in the words of barrister J.D. Casswell, she had already succumbed to the temptation of wartime separation. Pretty Caroline Trayler had learnt early how to console the lonely men of her native Folkestone while her husband served his country overseas. 4 days later, on 17th of June, Caroline's family reported her missing. It was in an empty, bombed-out grocer's shop at 94 Ford Road, near the railway viaduct and just minutes from the Mechanics' Arms, that Police Constable Lewis of the Folkestone Division made a tragic discovery. Finding the back gate and rear door unlocked, Lewis stepped inside and noticed a woman's blue suede shoe and a brown leather handbag lying on the floor. Further along the passageway leading to the front of the shop lay a young woman, face down on the dusty floorboards. PC Lewis flagged down an inspector driving past at the time, and the body was taken to the mortuary, where seasoned pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson conducted the post-mortem. Dr. Simpson confirmed that the cause of death was asphyxia due to manual strangulation, indicated by a fractured larynx and bruising to the throat and chin. He also found injuries consistent with sexual assault and surmised that she had first been gripped by the throat from the front, resisted her attacker, and was then turned face down and strangled from behind. A fresh tear on the nail of her left index finger suggested a struggle, and scrapings from under the nail revealed a wool fibre, possibly from the assailant's clothing. 6 dark hairs were found on her thighs that didn't match her own auburn hair, and investigators were hopeful this evidence might eventually lead to a suspect. Caroline Trayler's father, Fred Stapleton, was called in to identify the body. He worked less than 100 yards from the crime scene as a fire watcher, keeping vigil from a tall building to spot and report fires caused by German incendiary bombs. But he could have had no idea that on the streets below his lookout point, his daughter was being brutally murdered. He confirmed her identity and noticed that her rings were missing, presumably stolen by the killer. Police inquiries initially centred on the Mechanic's Arms, where landlady Dorothy Goldsworthy recalled Caroline talking to two soldiers on the night of her death. She remembered one of them glancing at the 18-year-old redhead, then turning to his friend and saying, "She's nice." The same man then bought her a drink. One of the soldiers left around 9:30 p.m, but the other, who spoke with a northern accent, stayed and entertained Caroline until closing time at 10 p.m, when the pair left together. 3 witnesses later saw Caroline with a soldier after she left the pub between 10:15 and 10:45 p.m, with the final sighting near the boarded-up shop where her body would later be found. None of them could clearly describe the man she was with, as soldiers were a common sight in the area and nothing about him had stood out. It was only when police turned their attention to nearby army camps that they began to make progress. At the Acris camp, 5 miles from Folkestone, they learnt that a Royal Artillery gunner had gone absent without leave on Friday 18th of June, the day after Caroline Trayler's body was discovered, and was now on the run. The man was 24-year-old Dennis Edmund Leckey. The night before Leckey's unauthorised absence, he had been quieter than usual, according to his bunkmate Fred Latham. Leckey said he was planning to travel home to Manchester for the weekend to check on his wife, whom he suspected of infidelity. He also let slip that he had left a pub with a girl the previous week, but they'd parted ways when she told him she had a date to keep. Later that same evening, Leckey reportedly asked another soldier, a gunner named Melia, "Have you heard about the girl in Folkestone who's been done in?" Melia replied that he hadn't and asked where the news had come from. Leckey claimed he'd seen it in the paper, but no article appeared in the press until the following morning. When pressed further, Leckey quickly changed the subject. It soon became clear that Dennis Leckey was not only AWOL, but also guilty of theft and fraud. He had taken a handful of leave passes along with a paybook belonging to his colleague Latham, then used it to collect Latham's weekly wages, carefully replacing the ID photo with one of himself. He then boarded a train to Manchester dressed in civilian clothes. His sergeant major gave police a photograph of the fugitive, who was described as 5'10", of medium build with dark hair and hazel eyes. The photo was shown to Mrs. Goldsworthy at the Mechanic's Arms, who identified him without hesitation as the man she'd seen talking to Caroline Trayler on Sunday 13th of June. A photo of Caroline was also shown to Leckey's friend, who had accompanied him to the pub that night, who confirmed she was the woman Leckey had been flirting with. Police stations across the country were put on alert with Leckey's description and instructed to arrest him on sight on suspicion of murder. In Manchester, officers visited his home at 34 Santley Road in Longsight, where they spoke to his wife, 21-year-old Beatrice. They learnt that the couple had married in 1939, just as the war broke out, and had 2 children. Dennis Leckey was born on 9th of April 1919 in Ashton-under-Lyne in Lancashire. He had worked as a clerk in a grocer's shop before joining the Territorial Army in May 1939 and was called up for active duty just 2 days before Britain declared war, following in the footsteps of his older brother Kenneth, a military police corporal, and his grandfather, a former army major. Beatrice confirmed that her husband had visited her briefly but had already left, without telling her where he was going. Acting on a tip that Leckey might be staying with a friend, Lance Bombardier Carney, detectives travelled to Stoke-on-Trent to find that Leckey had indeed been there but had already departed, once again slipping through the authorities' fingers. Carney told police that Leckey had made a strange comment about having an engagement and wedding ring which he claimed to have got from a girl in Ireland, but offered no further explanation. Could he have been referring to the rings taken from Caroline Trayler's body? Detectives believed this might be a crucial piece of evidence. After leaving his friend Carney, Leckey travelled to Ashton-under-Lyne to visit his mother-in-law, who later told police he had seemed nervous, which she had attributed at the time to fear of being posted overseas. By 28th of June, Dennis Leckey had returned to London, posing as an American under the name Gunnar Latham. He was spotted drinking with 2 US Army officers and a Canadian at the Queen's Hotel in Leicester Square, but had vanished by morning along with £5, a watch and their identity papers. The theft was reported to the American military police, and an officer from the American CID called in a tip to the Metropolitan Police that a suspect had just been seen drinking at a pub near Marble Arch. The police rushed to the scene, where they saw a man at the bar who closely resembled Leckey's description. He insisted his name was Latham, but they weren't convinced. He was arrested for theft and taken to Marylebone police station, where he was told he would also be questioned in connection with the murder of Caroline Trayler. Leckey seemed untroubled, announcing smugly, "You've got nothing on me." An identification parade was held, but none of the witnesses who'd seen Caroline leaving the Mechanic's Arms with a soldier on the night of her death could pick Leckey out of the lineup. They hadn't had a clear enough look at him, and by now, several weeks had passed. Leckey remained in custody while police sent his uniform to Dr. James Davidson at the Metropolitan Police Lab for analysis. On Leckey's trousers, Dr. Davidson found hairs identical to Caroline Trayler's, while pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson concluded that Leckey's own hair matched the 6 dark hairs discovered on the victim's body. The wool fibre recovered from under her fingernail was consistent with the material of a khaki shirt, like the one Leckey had been wearing. However, it could have come from any standard army issue shirt, so this couldn't be definitively traced to him. Detective Inspector Pearce formally charged Dennis Edmund Leckey with the murder of Caroline Trayler, to which Leckey replied, "I was with the girl. I want to be fair with you and to myself, and before I make a statement, I should like to get advice." These seemingly harmless words would later be dynamite in court. Leckey admitted to being with Caroline on the night of her death and claimed they had kissed, but said he left her shortly afterwards because she had another date. He said he then walked back to camp and met a Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer and had offered to carry her bag. He returned to camp around 1:30 a.m, excusing his lateness to the guard on duty by saying that he had seen a girl home. The guard corroborated this, as did Flight Officer Margaret Cook, whose bag Leckey had carried. Police found no evidence to support Leckey's claims of his wife's infidelity, suspecting instead that this was a cover story for why he had fled to Manchester so suddenly. More details emerged of the 24-year-old gunner's activities during his absence, and it turned out that on Tuesday 2nd of June, Leckey had met a woman named Winifred Woolley at Stafford railway station, impressing her with boasts of being an RAF fighter pilot. They travelled to Birmingham together, watched a film at a cinema, then went to a hotel for sex. Dennis Leckey stood trial at the Old Bailey on Monday 20th of September 1943, pleading not guilty. The prosecution, led by John Flowers KC, called 34 witnesses, including forensic experts. Flowers told the court that Leckey was a Jekyll and Hyde character capable of transforming from a friendly, sociable man into a violent felon with an unstoppable urge to rape and kill. When Leckey took the stand, he admitted to being with Caroline that night, though his story had developed. He now claimed she'd agreed to accompany him to an alleyway between two houses where they had consensual sex. When asked why he had taken so long to return to camp afterwards, he explained that he had felt unwell from drinking too much and had to stop and rest. But Flight Officer Margaret Cook, whom Leckey had escorted to the train station, agreed he had seemed absent-minded but was certain he wasn't drunk. As for his unusually quiet demeanour that had been noticed by colleagues, Leckey claimed he was feeling guilty about being unfaithful to his wife. The prosecution quickly reminded the jury that this claim was weakened by the fact that Leckey slept with Winifred Woolley in Birmingham shortly afterwards. Barrister J.D. Casswell had little to offer in Leckey's defence. No one could deny that he had been seen leaving the pub with the deceased, and his behaviour and incriminating remarks afterwards clearly suggested an attempt to flee from justice. Combined with the physical evidence of the hairs, it should have been an easy conviction. Yet this seemingly open and shut case had broken hinges. In his summing up, Mr. Justice Singleton made a fatal error. He told the jury, "On 30th of June, Detective Inspector Pearce saw the accused. He charged him with the offence and cautioned him, and the accused said, 'Well, I've nothing to say until I've seen a solicitor.' If a man is charged with murder and is not responsible, wouldn't you expect him to deny it? Is it not a little difficult to see why, if he were innocent, he wouldn't just say, 'I did not murder the girl. When I left her, she was all right'?" These words fundamentally undermine the accused's legal right to remain silent. 30 minutes later, the jury returned with a verdict. Dennis Edmund Leckey was found guilty of murder. Casswell immediately launched an appeal, arguing that the judge's summation had misdirected the jury by implying that a suspect who doesn't protest his innocence must be guilty. The Lord Chief Justice agreed. As a result, the murder conviction was quashed, and Leckey walked free in the eyes of civil law, though he was remanded to barracks to face the lesser military charge of being AWOL from the army. Even J.D. Casswell would later write that his client had had a very lucky escape. When Sergeant Joseph Trayler received the news of his wife's murder, he was recovering from wounds in a North African hospital. Denied leave to travel home, he too decided to absent himself from duty and travelled 3,000 miles back to England. For the next few weeks, he walked sadly around Folkestone, revisiting the places where he and Caroline had shared memories. He remained in Kent and later remarried. He had 3 children and died in Derbyshire in 2000, outliving his wife and one of his daughters. Dennis Leckey later moved to Ashton-under-Lyne with his wife and children. In February 1944, he changed his surname to Haynes, his mother's maiden name, presumably to avoid the infamy of his past. He worked briefly as a clerk, but in February 1945, he found himself back in the dock for fraud and was sentenced to 8 months in Manchester prison. While behind bars, he was questioned about a burglary, but there was insufficient evidence to charge him, and his mother provided an alibi. Having narrowly escaped an extension to his sentence, Dennis Leckey, aka Haynes, moved with his family to 1 Ennerdale Drive in Ormskirk, a market town in Lancashire. His life thereafter was unnoteworthy, and he died on 7th of March 1997 at the age of 77. Curiously, there was a Dennis Leckey who worked for nearby Rochdale Borough Council as an education officer from 1989 to 1997. This Leckey, also living in Ashton-under-Lyne, was charged with multiple counts of serious sexual offences against children, for which he was sentenced to 18 years in prison, though he served just half of his term. He was roughly the same age as Dennis Edmund Leckey's son, who was named Dennis after his father, with the middle name of John. Records show that the son also lived in Ashton-under-Lyne. While there is no definitive proof that the child abuser Leckey was the son of Dennis Edmund Leckey, who had been acquitted of Caroline Trayler's rape and murder, the coincidence is compelling. The Mechanics Arms pub, where Caroline had spent her final evening, was demolished in the 1960s. 94 Ford Road, the bombed-out shop where she was killed, is now a self-storage unit. Its grim past long forgotten. Do you think Dennis Edmund Leckey got away with murder on a technicality? Or could he have been innocent? If you're on Spotify or YouTube, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time.